but not once has she found anyone willing to actually smash the cup. So what is it? What is it that, while we enjoy this tradition, makes it very difficult for us psychologically to destroy something? And that's one of the issues that I want to reflect on. But just this morning, by chance, because I've been discussing this issue with a number of people, somebody came up also with the tradition in Nepal, next to India, the chula puni, which is another recyclable, disposable bowl. This has a curd in it for eating. And the chula puni is an annual festival when these bowls are smashed. It's an offering to the gods. But the bowls are also then dug into the soil, and it provides a very useful way of retaining water in the soil. So it has an agricultural function, but it's also very good, of course, for the potters who get to sell more work because people destroy their work. So this is something which I think if we dig deeper, we find in many different cultures. So what the first concept that I want to think about is the concept that was developed by the German writer just before the Second World War, Walter Benjamin, the angel of history. And it was based on a drawing, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, by Paul Klee, the Angelus Novus. And this drawing is of an angel which is being propelled backwards. The force of air, of wind, on the wings traps the angel, so it's being propelled, but can't see where it's going. It's facing the wrong direction. And for Walter Benjamin, this was an allegory of progress, that while in most of our lives we look at technological development, all the new things that are created, the wonders of science and economic growth, if we look the other way, we also see much destruction too. And it's an understanding of this, the rear view mirror of history, which can be quite important for us to understand in the broader sense of where we're going. This, of course, suggests many of the things we're familiar with. For instance, although development is alleviating poverty in the world, it also leads to a degree of monoculture where both in biology and in languages and culture, it's estimated we lose around 10,000 species a year due to development. And of course, the impact of energy, particularly fossil fuel use, means that the impact on the climate is very strong. And I believe this is an issue that's very important in Taiwan too, that the rate of temperature increase in Taiwan is about twice as high as other countries in the world. And of course, being an island, there is a greater vulnerability to the increase in water levels, and as well as the increased frequency of typhoons and floods and so on. So we become increasingly aware these days that progress comes at a cost, and that part of our understanding and our culture, part of what art does, is help us realize the other side of the story too. And ceramics has a very important place in this, in the idea of thinking back and connecting us to what's lost. Clearly, most museums, and certainly this museum does an excellent job, use the vestige of the past in the shard or the object of ceramic use, which may have been quite common and of its time, as a link to the past, to a world that has left us. And the studio ceramics movement, in a way, took this further by providing a way in which ceramics not only captures something which is lost to us in history, but also the time of the studio and the process. The emphasis, particularly in the Otis group with Peter Volkas, of ceramics which bears the traces of its production, which became a very important idea not just in ceramics but in art and sculpture generally, was the notion that the choreography at the wheel, the activity of the making, was realized in the final product, that you could see the gestures, the expression of the artist in this. It was very different to the more traditional notion of craftsmanship, which is to erase the trace of the maker in a sense of a perfection. But still, the idea that ceramics captures something ephemeral, whether it's the alchemy of the kiln, the interaction of the salts and the ash that creates a unique glaze, or the moment of the creation of the artist in the studio, has been a very important one. But what we see now in ceramics, and generally in the notion of process, is something which isn't just about capturing something of the past that has been lost to us and holding on to it. Because even with Peter Volker's work, which emphasizes the freedom of expression of the artist, it's still, in the end, creating an object that sits still on the plinth. It's designed to last as long as possible because it's a collectible item, it must. What we see now, of course, is process taken a little further, beyond just simply what happened before, but also what happens to the future, going back to what we saw with the chai cup. And I'm sure many of you now expect this slide coming up, which is the event which occurred in 1995 by Ai Weiwei, dropping the Han Dynasty urn. And so it's from the visual arts we see an approach to ceramics which is quite threatening. It's like the bull in the china shop. It's artists coming in to make work out of destroying ceramics. And so, reflecting what I was saying with Walter Benjamin, Ai Weiwei wanted to make a statement that while there is great progress, we also see with this the destruction of the past. And rather than pretend to preserve the past, we should allow ourselves to accept the fact that we are destroying it. And here I am destroying the past. That's what is happening. So it's a confrontation. And there's been much said about that, and people have even tried to imitate it recently, as some of the people from the United States know. But it was a shocking event. It's almost like the 9/11 of ceramics, this particular moment. So what I want to talk about now is thinking about what the implications of that are. And during this time, we've seen a lot of artists now beginning to use clay. Artists not trained in clay, and certainly not making finely crafted pieces. Artists very successful, like the Swiss duo, Fischli and Weiss, whose work at the Venice Biennale made quite powerful statements, sometimes uncanny, sometimes political, using unfired clay. So the work, in a sense, is not about an object that's to last. It's really about some moment, some provisional moment that is represented there. But with unfired clay, of course, we know that this is something which is inherently unstable. So we're likely with unfired clay to have work which is different at the beginning of the exhibition to at the end of the exhibition. So it's quite a challenge to think how we deal with that, because it goes against the grain of ceramics as something which is timeless in some way. So to go back to ceramics and to think about what it does in terms of the past, it's worth reflecting on the way in which ceramics is a very powerful medium for expressing a sense of loss. And this has been a very important theme in recent ceramics. Some of the most powerful here, I think, is represented by the Chinese ceramicist from Jingzhijian, Fu Weiming, which was at the Korean Ceramics Biennale before last, which reflected the trauma of the Sichuan earthquake. I think it was in 2009. And this is very powerful because when we see an earthquake, we see the destruction of the buildings foremost, the buildings made of clay, of bricks. It's harder to appreciate the trauma that occurs to the people involved. But when you make people out of the very material that the architecture is made out of, you feel that sense of momentousness that is the destruction of an earthquake, which is very powerful. So it's that material connection, I think, which is very important in ceramics, in the expression of loss. And then, of course, in cultural loss. And I think one of the many great things about this Biennale is the way that Kukuli Veladi's work has been curated into the second floor, looking at you in various corners. It's really quite fun and quite engaging. But with the idea of pre-Columbian ceramics, of course, part of the issue of colonization is the sense in which, although the Spanish came and conquered and destroyed so many indigenous cultures, we have the vestiges left. But with Kukuli's work, we see that the ceramics can actually talk back to you. It's alive. It's speaking to us now. It's reflecting on its time. So in the rich history of ceramics tradition and the politics of it, we can see the way in which artists are attempting to understand how it's caught up with the certain destruction of cultures. And then we see, and one of the signature pieces in the Biennale by Burke de Vries is the way in which the shard has emerged as an important material by people who are coming from the visual arts to express things. And certainly the sense of destruction, in this case evoking a nuclear holocaust, that ceramics can offer us is extremely powerful. And there have been a lot of exhibitions and conferences now looking at this particular theme, which seems very special to Northern Europe. And I'll talk about the impact of that in post-industrial in a minute. And then in terms of Neil Brownsword's work, we see the way in which this begins to tell the story of post-industrialization, the way in which the many factories that carried a very proud history of ceramics, like Wedgwood in England, have moved due to globalization. And with Neil's work, we see the way in which this work evokes not just the ceramic object, but all the elements that are part of the factory that are there to honour in his work, which is very powerful. As you might know, ceramics in Wedgwood was moved out of England in 2009 due to partly a response to the global economic crisis and the financial investments of the corporation. And it was put under administration by Deloitte, and its processes then moved to Indonesia. And it's very interesting to learn, as we have this morning here in Yingge, also in Taiwan, that process. And so part of what we're trying to understand is what we do with the ceramics as art in response to the post-industrial condition. So this movement in our society of traditions as they move around is being captured by the Polish writer Zygmunt Bauman in the term liquid modernities. This idea that in our time we are much more aware of the way in which the world is in flux, and where this isn't just in terms of climate and politics, but also in terms of technology. It can be argued that one of the challenges of digital technology originally was to try and store data, to try and preserve books, films, a whole range of things, images. But what's happened with all the various technologies now, the platforms, when you open your mobile phone and up come the status updates from Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, is that technology is very much about flows of data. It's a river. So, for instance, it's estimated that there have been around 300 billion tweets since Twitter first began. And based on that, since I've been speaking, around 50 million tweets have been written. Now, it doesn't really make sense to store all of that. No one would really want to. This is something of the moment. So part of what we're looking at, as well as understanding the loss, is a feeling of what is our world now. Our world isn't so much about preserving the past, but it's about channeling flows of information in different ways. So back to the post-industrial, many, not just ceramicists, but photographers. This is a Polish photographer, Grzegorz Stadnik, who has been documenting the empty and declining ceramics factories in Poland of late. Very poignant, very elegiac works. And what's very surprising, given the story that I told about Wedgwood and its move to Indonesia, is to see in the exhibition the collector from Bandung, Tramarama, reflecting also the loss of the Dutch heritage in Bandung due to historical change as well. And clearly I should mention the work of Shlomet Baumann in this exhibition, which talks about the depletion of stocks of clay that are occurring due to development. And in this case, the wonderful work that she's been doing on the particular clay S5, which I hope we'll hear more about during this conference. There's also the issue too with the depletion of kaolin stocks in the world, particularly due to the glossy magazine and the way in which kaolin is used to make a glossy cover on magazines as well. So ceramics is caught up in so many different ways with the issues in terms of what's being lost in our time. In Melbourne, we had an exhibition, Jasmine Target, which had visitors walk over ceramic tiles. So they were involved, they were complicit in the destruction of the work. And her work was about climate change and the loss of species and so on. So it's the sense of fragility in ceramics, the fact that it can break, is a perfect material for representing the fragility of the planet and the way in which our actions can have a role in its survival. In a political way, I think in terms of a visual artist, the Algerian artist Abed Abdesemed has used work which has a very powerful message. This installation is based on the workers in Qatar, in the Middle East, who often come from countries like Nepal or Bangladesh, who are paid for something like $100 a month. Sometimes they're indentured just simply to pay out the debts involved in travelling to Qatar. But the use of unfired clay to represent these workers also represents very well the provisional nature of their life, the sense in which they have very little backup in terms of health insurance or security, just like these figures being unfired. And what happens, of course, is that these figures fall off during the course of the exhibition. And I was very pleased to see the work of Jure Kim, the Korean artist, because one of the other elements of unfired clay, of course, is it can dissolve, is the fact that it isn't resistant to water. So she's been able to realise this in quite an amazing way, which I look forward to seeing during the course of the time in this exhibition as this architecture begins to dissolve. And there's some sense of beauty in this as well as sadness. And the Argentinian artist, Adrian Villarojas, Today We Reboot the Planet, which this is a representation of Kurt Cobain, the rock singer, and which is an unfired clay, but using the unfired clay to grow plants and to create a scene of uncontrolled nature, a sense of both decay but also of wildness there as these potatoes sprout and so on from this work. Again, the work is very different at the beginning of the exhibition to at the end, and maybe it doesn't even last beyond the exhibition. And I'm very proud to see the Australian Pip McManus with her work, which represents this dissolution, this dissolving of clay in a very beautiful way, and a way which, as an Australian, helps us reflect on the issue of those refugees who are trying to travel by boat, by leaky boat, to get to Australia, and so many drown in the sea. So it has a particular kind of resonance for us in Australia as well. But it works at many different levels, at both a spiritual level, but also an aesthetic level as well. So these are, I think, really interesting ways in which we're beginning to see ceramics representing loss not just as a sense of sadness, as a necessary melancholic response to what's lost, but also there is some beauty in this as well. So the question I want to pose in the second part of my talk is about this sense of destruction and what it means for, as I say, to destroy something like this for us is very difficult. And partly it's because we're modern people and we want to hold on to things. How can we see that the destruction of this is something to be celebrated in some way. And the second author that I want to refer to is the French sociologist Georges Bataille, who wrote a book in 1949, The Accursed Share, which was looking at the way in which many traditional societies practice sacrifice, where at the end of a season, when there's usually an abundance of produce as a result of a harvest, what happens is that there's a festival or a religious celebration when sacrifices are offered up to the gods. And this seemed to be a very relatively universal practice in traditional societies. It changes in modernity because part of the idea of capitalism is that rather than waste what's in surplus, we take it as profit and we reinvest that profit. We save it, we exchange it for money, we barter it, and so on. And this, for many of us, is a more useful way of understanding the fruits of our labour, a more practical way of dealing with it. But for sociologists like Georges Bataille, this can also mean that society loses its connection, loses the sense of itself involved in a cycle. It's always deferring, in a sense, the benefits of its labour to a future time. It's something which makes us disconnected